The Legends of New Mexico History Channel. The Legends of New Mexico History Channel presents. The Lincoln County War. The Lincoln County War. The war that created Billy the Kid. Brought to you by Trajity. Zia Strong Entertainment. Lost Productions. Act 1.
In the late 1870s, the American frontier was exploding into violence. In the deserts of New Mexico Territory, corruption ruled the land. Powerful businessmen controlled towns. Politicians chose sides. Lawmen became killers. And ordinary cowboys were dragged into a war for power and survival. This conflict became known as the Lincoln County War. From that chaos, one young gunman would become a legend. His name was Billy the Kid. But this is not just Billy's story. It is the story of a county consumed by violence in the war that changed New Mexico forever. During the 1870s, Lincoln County was one of the largest and most dangerous counties in the American West. Stretching across deserts, mountains, and isolated ranch lands, it was far from federal control. In many places, the law barely existed. Small towns clung to life along dry riverbeds. Cowboys drifted from ranch to ranch. Debt and fear shaped daily life. In Lincoln County, one business empire controlled nearly everything. Locals called it the House. Led by Lawrence Murphy and James Dolan, the House controlled trade, cattle, supplies, credit, and political influence across the county. Ranchers depended on them for loans. Merchants depended on them for goods. Local officials often answered to them. Business, politics, and law fused into a single power. To many settlers, Lincoln County was no democracy. It was a monopoly enforced through fear, debt, and violence. Then in 1876, a young English businessman named John Tunstall arrived in New Mexico Territory. Intelligent, ambitious, and backed by family money, Tunstall saw opportunity in Lincoln County. He also saw corruption. Tunstall joined forces with Alexander McSween, an attorney and businessman who also opposed the House. Together, they built a rival store, assembled cattle herds, and tried to break the county's monopoly. In most places, that would have been competition. In Lincoln County, it was defiance. The more Tunstall and McSween succeeded, the more dangerous their position became. Among the men working for Tunstall was a teenage drifter named Henry McCarty. He had wandered across the frontier, picking up jobs, trouble, and a few charges along the way. He had escaped jail, been called a thief, and already knew how quickly violence could find a young man. But he was still just a teenager looking for somewhere to belong. On Tunstall's ranch, Henry found steady work, respect, and a sense of loyalty. Tunstall treated his riders better than most men in that country. For Henry, it felt less like a job and more like a home. History would remember Henry by another name, Billy the Kid. But then, he was not yet a legend. He was simply another cowboy in a county growing more dangerous by the day. By early 1878, pressure from the House was building. Lawsuits, intimidation, and armed threats made clear that this fight would not stay in courtrooms or offices. Billy could have drifted away, as he had before. Instead, he stayed. Then on February 18th, 1878, everything changed. A posse tied to the House cornered John Tunstall outside Lincoln. Gunfire erupted. Tunstall fell from his horse. John Tunstall was murdered. For the young men who worked for him, the killing was personal. They believed the law would never punish the men responsible. So they chose to seek justice themselves. Billy the Kid was one of them. The men formed a vigilante group called the Regulators. Under Dick Brewer and alongside Charlie Baudry and Jose Chavez, Billy stepped fully into the war. What began as a mission to arrest Tunstall's killers quickly became open violence. The Regulators hunted down the accused. Some were captured, others were killed. With every ride, the line between justice and revenge grew thinner. Stories about Billy began to spread. To some, he was fearless. To others, he was becoming a killer. Even Sheriff William J. Brady became a target. In April of 1878, the Regulators ambushed Brady in the streets of Lincoln. Brady fell dead in broad daylight. After that, there was no turning back. Billy was no longer just an avenger. He was a wanted cop killer in a county collapsing into war. In the weeks after Brady's death, the violence only deepened. One pursuit led the Regulators to a remote sawmill called Blazer's Mill. There they met Buckshot Roberts, a deadly gunfighter who refused to surrender. The fight was short, brutal, and chaotic. Dick Brewer was killed. Buckshot Roberts died soon after. Blazer's Mill brought no real victory, only more dead. As spring turned to summer, the war spread across ranches and towns. Families fled, burned homes, and settlers who wanted no part of the conflict were forced to choose sides. Politicians and army officers began to view Lincoln County as a crisis that had to be contained. Billy saw the cost up close: ruined ranches, frightened families, and killings that no longer had much to do with John Tunstall. The world Tunstall had offered was gone. The war had become survival and vendetta. By July 1878, the conflict exploded into its final and largest confrontation. Alexander McSween and his allies, Billy among them, barricaded themselves inside a house in Lincoln. For 5 days, gunfire echoed through town. Riflemen fired from rooftops, alleys, and doorways while civilians hid wherever they could. Inside the siege, Billy fought from room to room, returning fire and searching for a way out. When bullets failed to finish the fight, the attackers set the house on fire. Smoke filled the rooms. The roof began to fail. The men inside had to run or burn. McSween tried to escape under cover of darkness. Men burst from the flames and into gunfire. McSween was killed, but Billy escaped through smoke and darkness, fighting his way out of Lincoln. When the sun rose, the battle was over. The McSween house was gone, and the war had effectively burned itself out. Dozens were dead, businesses were shattered, families were scattered, and despite all the bloodshed, corruption did not disappear. For Billy the Kid, the war's end brought no peace. It left him a fugitive, hunted across the territory. Wanted posters and newspaper stories carried his name far beyond New Mexico, turning him into a national figure. Around barrooms and campfires, his legend grew with every retelling. Some called him a folk hero, others called him a murderer. Soon Pat Garrett would begin the manhunt that made Billy famous across America. The Lincoln County War had transformed Billy from a drifting teenager into a symbol of rebellion, lawlessness, and survival. But the war was bigger than Billy. It turned ordinary men into outlaws and martyrs, and carried New Mexico's violence into the mythology of the Wild West. Long after the gunfire ended, the story remained, echoing across the desert and through American legend. In the deserts of New Mexico, the echoes of the Lincoln County War still remain. The Lincoln County War scarred the land and reshaped the lives of everyone who rode through it. It began as a struggle over cattle, credit, and control, and ended as a symbol of what unchecked power and broken law could do on the frontier. Billy the Kid did not start that war. But in the fire and confusion of Lincoln County, his choices, his loyalties, and his survival helped turn a local conflict into an enduring legend of the American West. In the end, the Lincoln County War was not just history on a dusty frontier, but a warning about power, justice, and the thin line between them.
Act 2.
July 1878. The smoke from the Battle of Lincoln still hung over the town like a dark memory. The shooting had stopped, but Lincoln looked like a battlefield. Bodies lay in the streets, homes and businesses were ruined. The war was over, for everyone except Billy the Kid. He was just 18 years old, thin, wiry, and still growing into his own reputation. In the chaos, Billy had done what he always seemed able to do: survive. Most of the Regulators, the faction Billy had fought with, were dead or scattered. The alliance that had carried him into the war had collapsed. The town of Lincoln was a graveyard, and Billy rode out of it alone. disappeared into the desert darkness, Billy was no longer just another gunman in a regional feud. His name was already spreading across the Southwest. Newspapers exaggerated his role in the Lincoln County War. Some called him a ruthless killer who shot men down for sport. Others hinted that he was a daring young fighter standing up to powerful and corrupt interests. In saloons and campfires, the stories grew taller. With every retelling, Billy the Kid drifted further from the complicated reality of a teenager caught in a brutal power struggle, and closer to legend. To ranchers and businessmen aligned with Lincoln's old power structure, Billy was a menace who needed to be hunted down. To some small farmers and laborers, he looked like the only man willing to stand up to the people who ran the territory like a private empire. But beyond the campfire tales, the Lincoln County War had created a deeper problem. Reports of the violence and lawlessness made New Mexico look unstable, ungovernable, and embarrassing in the eyes of politicians back east. The federal government wanted order, investors wanted stability, and Washington wanted someone to clean up the mess that Lincoln had become. That someone was Lew Wallace, the new territorial governor of New Mexico. Wallace was no ordinary political appointee. He had worn Union blue as a general in the Civil War, commanding men in some of the bloodiest battles of the conflict. After the war, he reinvented himself as a writer. In time, he would become famous as the author of the novel Ben-Hur. But when he arrived in New Mexico in 1878, he was not a celebrated author. He was a governor sent to stop the territory from spiraling out of control. What he found was a place where the law barely reached beyond town lines. Business rivalries could erupt into shooting wars. Sheriffs and judges might work for whoever paid them best. As Wallace sifted through depositions, letters, and reports from Lincoln, one name kept appearing again and again: Billy the Kid. To some, the young outlaw was the problem. To Wallace, he was beginning to look like something even more dangerous: a symbol. For Wallace, Billy the Kid was not just a name in the files. He was the thread that tugged on the whole tangled knot of New Mexico's troubles. Across the territory, law did not always mean justice. Sheriffs might be on a rancher's payroll. Judges could be close friends of powerful merchants. Cattle rustlers doubled as hired gunmen. Old enemies put on badges and called it peace. Bribery, cattle theft, and shifting alliances turned the frontier into a chessboard. The Lincoln County War had simply made the corruption impossible to ignore, and almost every report, every complaint, every terrified letter from Lincoln mentioned Billy the Kid. Wallace understood that Billy was both symptom and symbol. If he could bring the kid in peacefully, if he could turn this notorious outlaw into a witness, maybe he could expose the men who had turned Lincoln into a killing ground. It was a risky idea. Make peace with an outlaw in order to put so-called respectable citizens on trial. In early 1879, Wallace decided to gamble. From his office in Santa Fe, he sent word down the line: if Billy the Kid would come in and testify about the killings in Lincoln, the governor would consider a full pardon. Messages moved through back channels and trusted go-betweens. Billy was still on the run, still wanted. Meeting the governor meant riding straight toward the very system that had been trying to kill him. But Billy was also tired. Tired of hiding, tired of losing friends, tired of watching others profit from the chaos. A clean slate, a real pardon, must have sounded like the one way out that didn't end at the end of a rope. Under cover of darkness, Billy the Kid rode back toward Lincoln. The same town that had nearly killed him was now the place where he hoped to trade his testimony for his freedom. The meeting between Billy and Governor Lew Wallace took place in secret. No reporters, no crowds, just a wanted outlaw and the man charged with restoring order to the territory.
Governor, I'll tell you what I know. Names, dates, who ordered what. But I want something real in return. A full pardon, not just promises.
You testify truthfully, and I will do what I can. I cannot rewrite the past, but I can decide what happens next.
In that dark room, Billy claimed he was willing to expose the corruption behind the Lincoln County War. The men who had hidden behind deputies and hired guns. Wallace, seeing a chance to rewrite the story of Lincoln, agreed to use Billy as a key witness. Billy the Kid did something few legends ever do. He walked into a courtroom and tried to work within the law. Under heavy guard, he testified about the killings, the ambushes, and the men who had pulled the strings. He believed that every word brought him closer to a promised pardon. But politics move slower than bullets. After the testimony, nothing happened. Days turned into weeks. Legal motions, technicalities, and private objections surfaced. Powerful men did not want their names dragged through more trials. Letters and telegrams pressed Wallace from all sides. Some demanded that Billy hang. Others wanted the whole matter quietly forgotten. The governor's bold gamble began to look less like justice and more like political suicide. Billy waited. He had done what he was asked to do, but the pardon he expected never came. Whether Wallace lost his nerve or whether other men blocked the deal, the result was the same. Billy the Kid felt he had been used, then abandoned. And when the law failed him, Billy went back to what he knew best. He seized an opportunity, slipped past his keepers, and vanished once more into the New Mexico night. Whatever fragile trust had existed between Billy the Kid and Governor Lew Wallace was broken. From that moment on, Billy stopped waiting on promises from politicians, and the territory braced itself for the return of its most famous outlaw.
Act 3.
By 1880, Billy the Kid moved through New Mexico like a rumor on horseback. He stole horses, crossed open desert, laughed at campfires, and slipped away before posses could close in. Every escape made him harder to catch and bigger in the public imagination. Ranchers woke to empty corrals. Riders found tracks and then nothing. Billy changed horses, changed trails, and used the land better than most men chasing him. He knew where to hide, where to water, and where pursuit would break down. He rode dry washes, ridges, and back routes that punished older pursuers. To the law, he was a growing embarrassment. To people reading about him, he was becoming something larger than life. At night, he could seem almost carefree, He joked, played cards, and grinned like a reckless young drifter instead of the outlaw described in official reports. That contrast only deepened his mystique. Rewards rose, he wanted posters spread, sheriffs compared notes and failed again. By 1880, Billy the Kid had become the most wanted outlaw in New Mexico. Newspapers seized on the story. Editors knew Billy sold copies, so presses turned his name into spectacle. Headlines exaggerated crimes, we'd inflated body counts, and blurred rumor into fact. A shootout became a massacre. An escape became proof of impossible daring. The real Billy hid, bled, and ran. The printed Billy was already a legend. In saloons and stores, people argued over those stories. Some believed them. Others, especially those who understood the corruption behind the Lincoln County struggle, saw something more complicated. Billy spoke fluent Spanish and moved easily among local New Mexicans. He joked, bargained, listened, and earned trust. In villages and ranch settlements, he was not just a hunted outlaw, he was someone people knew.
Ten cuidado, Billy. La ley viene esta noche.
Many ordinary New Mexicans did not excuse the killings, but some saw Billy as a young man shaped by violence and corruption rather than born to it. They warned him, fed him, hid him, and sometimes helped him vanish. Lawmen saw only a dangerous fugitive who made the territory look weak. The hunt needed someone stubborn enough to finish it. That man was Pat Garrett, the new sheriff of Lincoln County. Garrett had known Billy before. He understood his charm, his habits, and the risk of underestimating him. Now duty, politics, and reputation pushed Garrett toward a final collision with the outlaw he once knew. Garrett rode out with armed posses across a hard country of dust, scrub, and long distances. For months, he followed hoofprints, rumors, old campfires, and frightened whispers. Dust storms erased tracks. Informants contradicted one another. Wanted posters faded while Billy kept moving. The chase became a test of patience as much as force. Garrett kept narrowing the map until in December 1880, he finally closed in at Stinking Springs. Billy and his companions had taken shelter in a small house, thinking they had a little time. Before dawn, Garrett's men surrounded it.
Billy, this is Pat Garrett. You're surrounded. Best come out and end this while you still can.
Gunfire shattered the cold silence. Bullets struck the adobe walls as the men inside searched for any way out. Charlie Boder moved toward the door in the freezing dark. Garrett's men fired, thinking Boder was Billy. Boder fell mortally wounded. It was another death in a story already swollen by violence and legend. Surrounded and with no real path left, Billy understood the fight was over. He surrendered at last. The most wanted man in New Mexico stepped out not as a myth, but as a tired young prisoner in chains. His capture spread quickly. Crowds came to stare. But in court, fame meant nothing. Billy was convicted of murder and sentenced to hang. Once the sentence came down, there seemed to be no way out. He was taken to the Lincoln courthouse to await execution. Deputies watched him, but routine can dull caution even around dangerous men. Billy watched everything: keys, weapons, stairways, windows, habits, and the moments when attention drifted.
You ain't slipping out this time, kid.
Billy only smiled. He was waiting for one last opening. In April, that chance came. A guard was distracted. A weapon was close enough. In seconds, Billy struck. A gunshot echoed on the stairs. One deputy fell dead. Billy seized another weapon and moved before the courthouse could trap him again. When the second deputy ran outside, Billy fired from above. By the end of the breakout, 2 lawmen were dead. It became one of the most famous jailbreaks in Western history. But the truth was stark. Billy survived by killing the men guarding him. Then he broke his remaining restraints, found a horse, and rode out of Lincoln as the town reeled. Once again, Billy the Kid vanished into New Mexico. The escape renewed his legend, but it also made the hunt more relentless. There would be no mercy now. For months, Garrett kept searching. Reports came from every direction. But again and again, suspicion returned to Fort Sumner, where Billy had friends and familiar ground. Garrett followed that trail patiently, convinced the chase was narrowing toward its end. On July 14, 1881, Fort Sumner lay quiet under moonlight. Garrett arrived with 2 companions and moved carefully through the dark. Inside a dark room, Garrett waited and listened. Billy approached without knowing who was there. Hearing movement, he stopped and called out.
¿Quién es? ¿Quién es?
Garrett fired twice. In seconds, the hunted outlaw lay dying on the floor. Billy the Kid was dead at only 21 years old. But Billy's story did not end with his death. He was buried near Fort Sumner, yet almost immediately the legend resumed. Newspapers revisited the chase. Writers reshaped the tale. Old photographs, courtroom memories, and rumor all fed the same question. Who had Billy really been? Dime novels, popular histories, and later Hollywood pushed him further from reality. Some made him a monster. Others made him a rebel hero. Together, they transformed Billy the Kid into one of the greatest legends of the American West. The judgment remained divided. To some, Billy was a ruthless outlaw whose trail left blood behind. To others, he stood for rebellion against corruption and power. That tension kept the story alive. The facts alone were never enough. People wanted meaning, and Billy's short life offered conflicting ones. At his grave, people still come searching for the outlaw, the boy, the killer, the victim, or the legend. And in the deserts of New Mexico, through newspapers, stories, film, and memory, the legend of Billy the Kid still rides on.
Got a 6-pack, riding shotgun seat. Not for the thirst, just to keep me company. One for the road that I didn't take, one for the promises I couldn't make. Two for the nights I outpaced the truth, one for the man I was back in my youth. Last one waits like a closing door. I ain't running from it anymore. days just static in skin. Rear view holds what I want outrun, but it don't get to decide what I become. Sweat and silence, a steady trade. No one here to be impressed or saved. I learned slow, but I learned it clean. You don't lose everything you leave. Sky goes wide like it's letting go. I don't fight what I already know. Got a six-pack, riding shotgun seat. Not for the thirst, just to keep me company. One for the road that I didn't take, one for the promises I couldn't make. Two for the nights I outpaced the truth, one for the man I was back in my youth. Last one waits like a closing door. I ain't running from it anymore. Heat. Every heartbeat lands on its feet. I don't need forgiveness spelled out loud, just a little less weight in the dust I plow. If I crack that last one, it won't be escape. It'll be a line I finally don't erase. Got a six-pack, riding shotgun seat.